Well, hello everyone. This is Lindsay and Justin with Business Back and Forth. And we have another cool project story. I don't know about you, but I'm absolutely loving these and sitting down with Justin and just hearing just some of those really cool projects that he's worked on and just dive into some of those questions and pick his brain and learn as much as I can.
Part of what makes a consultant valuable is their breadth of experience. So I'm really happy to share and just think about these projects again. It's been a long time since I've worked on some of these that we've talked about, but it's nice to think about them and the lessons learned from those and apply it to what we're doing today.
And let me just tell you, I know obviously a lot of you are not going to be watching this per se, but he does light up. He absolutely lights up when he talks about these projects and stuff. But it's fun. You can tell that he really thoroughly enjoys just going back through those Rolodex of memories of all those projects he's had before. So today we're going to cover SEVP, which is Student Exchange Visitor Program. Let's start with the simple stuff. What does Student Exchange Visitor Program mean?
All right. So the Student Exchange Visitor Program is a program authorized through the Department of State and the Department of Homeland Security. And its whole purpose is to track and monitor people who are in the United States on a student visa. And the idea is that when someone wants to come to the U.S. and study, be it at a university, a technical school, a flight school, any type of school, they need to have a student visa. And there needs to be a method to track them and know their whereabouts. And so the SEVP program is all about that purpose. And it's a cool collaboration between Department of State and Homeland Security.
When in your career did you work on this project?
This one takes me back quite a ways. This takes me back into the more 2010, 2011 range. So I worked for a small consulting firm at the time whose sole intent as a company was to elicit and capture requirements. They didn't build software. They didn't do much in design. Their whole purpose was around requirements definition, which is pretty cool. That's one of many things we do now at APG. But they were subcontracted by what's called a prime contractor in the government space to do this work, to go in and work on the SEVP modernization program. So the SEVP program was under a lot of scrutiny after 9/11. On 9/11, just as a brief history lesson, on 9/11, the hijackers of the airplanes that crashed into New York and the Pentagon and Pennsylvania were all here on student visas and had been studying at flight schools. And unfortunately, they learned enough in the flight schools to hijack those planes and fly those airplanes into buildings and into the field when the other people took over and stopped them from crashing into the White House, I think, or the Capitol. I forget where that last plane was headed. Either way, they were here on student visas. So the 9/11 Commission did its investigation, learned this reality, and mandated that the SEVP program modernize its technology very quickly so that they could better track people who were here on student visas. And that was our sole intent, was to elicit and capture those requirements that would ultimately be built into better software.
That's heavy. That's heavy with the unfortunate part of our history.
It is.
So what made this particular project special in your mind?
That direct lineage of the project back to the 9/11 Commission, and certainly 9/11 before that, meant a lot, because I think all of us who were alive at the time and old enough to remember where we were on 9/11.
Right.
I remember it vividly. And certainly the impact in the years after and all the trailing effects of what that has meant for those families and the people who lived in those cities at the time. So though I've never been enlisted in the military per se, to be able to serve the government and to serve our country in this respect meant a ton to me. I think it checked all the boxes for what defines meaningful work. Just to be able to understand what were the problems that led to those men getting those licenses and being here on a student visa, and to be able to correct that actually meant a lot.
What was unique about working with the Department of State, the Department of Homeland Security?
Well, certainly when any of us go to work with a corporation, a private owned corporation or publicly traded, we may have to do a financial background check or criminal background check or drug test. When you go to work with the government, you have to do all of those things and much, much more. So my team, myself included, had to achieve a certain level of security clearance in order to even have these conversations. And that's why I can't get into too many nuts and bolts of what we're talking about today. Though I don't have my security clearance active anymore, we aren't able to openly talk about the nuts and bolts of this. But what I can say is the government does a fine job of thoroughly investigating everyone, to the extent of talking to family and neighbors and friends, just to do character references and background references to make sure that you're best equipped to work on something like this. So working with them in that respect was interesting. And I think the other thing is there aren't that many programs, surprisingly, where state and Homeland Security actually work hand in hand. Each major organization within the federal government is kind of its own silo, and information sharing and collaboration isn't really that big a thing between those silos. And this was all about bringing two of the biggest, most prominent silos together. And that was an absolute pleasure to facilitate. I was involved in DC for roughly 18 months working on this.
Okay.
And it meant three workshops per week for 18 months. So I can't do the quick math, but that's a ton of workshops where I had to be on my A game as the facilitator in working sessions with large stakeholder groups that had never worked together before, with much different cultural the organization culture between Department of State and Homeland Security were very different. So I had the people who were much more like police officers and those in uniform on the Homeland Security side, and I had more of the peacemaker and policymakers from Department of State, and getting those two to talk and collaborate and agree was like bridging quite a divide. And that was my joy for 18 months.
Yeah, I'm sure it was towing the line and having to put yourself on in both teams' shoes in a sense, and like how do you bridge that gap, and how do you really make things come across a certain way so we all could come to solutions.
That's right. Well, on something this important, I think fundamentally everyone knew we had to get this done. There was no not getting this done. It was just figuring out how do we best work together.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
What were the people like who worked for both of those organizations?
You know, as I say, on the Department of State side, they're much more policymakers and peacemakers. I don't want to dumb down their work at all, but they really are more on the policy side of the house, and they're working externally with other governments in the embassies around the world, and to put in these procedures so that people really can legally apply and come to the country and do their education. Millions of people have done this and will continue to do this, and we need them to do that. On the Homeland Security side, they are much more concerned with what's going on from our borders in. And so it's bridging that. Those are the two dynamics. One has this international purview and the other has more of the domestic purview. And so the personalities between those two were very, very different. Their priorities were very different. Their success criteria were very different, but we had to pull them together to create common policies and common viewpoints on this important process.
And mesh a lot of that.
Yes.
What made going to work there different than going to work in a normal company? I'm sure there's plenty to that.
Well, the fact that for several of these workshops in the 18 months, I worked 4 levels underground underneath DC. That was a big one. I wasn't there, but if you recall, years ago, there was an earthquake that hit DC or underneath DC. It cracked the Washington Monument. David Rubenstein paid for the restoration of the Washington Monument. It had this big crack in it, and it was closed for a long time. I had a team working in that 4-level underground office during the earthquake, and to say they were, well, you could say shaken, pun intended, but they were really startled to be underground during an earthquake. But anyway, working logistically, it's like going through TSA every day that you go to work. And there's just this sense of history when you go into these buildings. When we walked into the headquarters of the Department of State, and I'd seen that lobby and those flags on TV 100 times before, but to actually be walking through there myself, going to accomplish work, For a guy from Georgia that's not lived and worked in Northern Virginia and DC at all in the government space, it was really impactful. It's hard to put into words the sense of responsibility just that setting imparts in everyone. And I think we all felt it on our team for sure.
And I think it ties back to, like you said in the beginning, that was your sense of pride and duty back to the country. But being able to walk into those halls that so many people and so many huge, people in our country have walked through as well.
Literally where history is made. And we're just adding one sub chapter within one giant book. And it was fantastic.
That's great. What were the outcomes of your work with SEVP?
Well, the outcome was that the specifications we created some really unique methods to do what they needed to do. So it wasn't as dry as let's define some forms and capture some data and pass approvals around. There's more things going on in that system that I can talk about, and they were truly cutting edge for the time. It made everyone feel very good about what we had created. At the end of it, there was a bit of a road show where we went to other countries and demonstrated this to the embassies and to our partners in other countries that the Department of State in particular worked with. And there was a lot of pride in it. What's nice is the actual system did get built. As I mentioned, the firm I worked for was responsible for requirements. The contract was then taken to an engineering firm that actually engineered the software and built and deployed the software. That's just how it worked in that environment. Once the system was built, one of the most tangible results of it is that it helped stop what would have been a terrorist attack here in the US. And it was one piece, right? When you stop a terrorist act, it's not just a piece of software that's doing it. It's this whole orchestrated symphony of experts. The software played an important role in it. It actually highlighted a risk. That risk was brought to the attention of people that needed to see it, and they stopped someone who was actually determined to do something significant here in the US. And just if all of this 18 months of work and then the engineering after that stopped one event of the scale that this one was to have been, it was completely worth it. It was worth it tenfold, if not 100-fold. So that felt pretty darn good.
Absolutely. If you knew then what you know now, what would you have done differently?
Some of the big things of what I know now, practice makes perfect. I enjoy facilitating workshops. I've done a lot more of it since those years. And so I have a lot more tips and tricks and techniques that I can apply when you have totally distinct personalities in the room that need to gain consensus. So there are a lot of facilitation tips and tricks that I know now that I would apply then. I think also the concept of rapid prototyping that we use at APG today, where as we're eliciting requirements, we're actually visualizing what the system will look like. So it's not that we're talking about this, let's say we were building a student profile that has certain information in it, and we're just talking about it. We're looking at the screen up here, and my designer is starting to design it as we're talking about it. So someone around the table can say, yes, that's exactly what I was thinking, or no, that's not what I was thinking at all. I promise it's way faster and way cheaper to have that moment of clarity now while we're talking about requirements than once it's in the hands of the developers and they have code to unwind if it's done incorrectly. So those are probably the two biggest things: different facilitation skills and the rapid prototyping piece.
That's awesome. And that's just over time, just experience.
Correct.
That's part of building a career and learning as you go.
That's right. Well, and APG is a 5-year-old company as of the recording that this is taking place. You may listen to it in 2 years and we'll be 7 years old. But what I say all of that to mean we don't have 5 years of experience as a team. Each of us brings stories like this to the table, and we all lean on these stories in order to inform what we're doing today, be it in healthcare, financial services, or public sector. It doesn't matter. We all have this baseline, and we're bringing this expertise to the table.
Well, thank you, Justin, for sharing that. And thank you for playing a part in that, because that sounds like a really big project that was not only meaningful, but it was also impactful for everyone.
Thank you, Lindsay. Appreciate it.